Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 9 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I won a nice game against a talented German player, and after round 8, I actually was on 5.5 out of 8, so really good score, and I'd only lost one game through 8 rounds, and was playing pretty well, so I knew that I'd be close to the top going into the last round. Now, because I'd only played one GM and I'd played down so many games, I was not in line for a GM norm. To get a GM norm, you have to play at least 3 Grandmasters, and I knew that I'd play a strong player in round 9, but, it would probably only be my second Grandmaster. And so it is what it is, but, I would still have the opportunity to get a lot of points, and that's something that also matters on the path to Grandmaster. You need to be 2,500 rated FIDE. So points matter just as much as the norms, and in some instances can be actually harder than the norms. In any case, my opponent in this one was none other than Dmitrij Kollars, a young, talented Grandmaster from Germany. It's kind of funny because I'd actually had seen this name in games before, the European Championships and various wall charts, but I actually never had seen this player before, and I just assumed he was like an older guy, and it was a shock to me when I looked him up and I realized he was so young, because he actually is a real talent. And I think that's kind of a funny thing, is I've heard of most Grandmasters in the world, probably all of them, honestly, but I haven't actually seen all of them, know what they look like, and it's always funny when you get that surprise when you actually look them up or wind up playing them. In any case, I was white in this one, and I was hoping to just get a position where, I could kind of show my mettle, and yeah, let's get into it. So I opened with d4. Dmitrij played knight f6. I played knight f3, g6, and if you saw a previous video, I struggled against the Grunfeld and the King's Indian in this tournament. In round 1, I had a draw with white in the Grunfeld, and then in round 7, I had a miracle escape with white in the Fianchetto King's Indian. So I figured, I'm not really going to wait and see which line he's kind of sat on and maybe prepared pretty deeply, and decided to play a London system with bishop f4. And funnily enough, part of the decision was actually inspired by my round 8 game, because if you saw that one, it actually was kind of a London system reversed for black, where the bishop gets outside the pawn chain, and then I put my pawns on, well, it was black, but it was basically e6 and c6, and I actually liked the position I got there, so I thought, why don't I just do the same thing with white and see what happens? At least I won't get into major trouble out of the opening. So I actually opted for this, and it actually helped me make my moves relatively quickly, because a lot of the London system moves, particularly against the King's Indian, are fairly automatic. So after bishop f4, bishop g7, e3, c5, and c5 told me that he was going to play the London system against the London system in the King's Indian style, because the other way to play it is to play in the Grunfeld style with d5. And even though the computers tend to think this is totally fine for black, I always believe that white has the easier time of it here, because this bishop is pretty much unassailable on this diagonal, whereas the bishop on g7 is actually biting on granite on this d4 pawn. So it just seems like the difference in activity of the bishops should matter a little bit. In any case, after c5, I went c3, just reinforcing this pawn again, and then black went b6. I went bishop e2, castles, and now d6. And whenever black plays d6, it's kind of a clear signal that you probably want to give your bishop an escape square, because now knight h5 becomes a threat trying to secure the bishop pair. Note that in the previous position before d6, like if we just back up here, I have bishop e5 as an option, and after knight h5, black would be reluctant to play f6 and weaken this whole diagonal. So the point is that once d6 is played, he's kind of taken that square away from me. And because of that, I now played h3, securing the h2 square for my bishop, should it be harassed. After h3, black went bishop b7, knight bd2, knight bd7, and then I went a4, and these are all the standard London system moves. Nothing new has been played just yet. Basically, white plays this thrust to kind of, eye the b5 square, but also tease a5 as well, trying to challenge black's pawn structure, maybe create a pawn island. If you saw the round 8 video again, you saw that this a4, a5 thrust, or rather with black, I played a5 trying to go a4 to create some weaknesses on the queen side. So this is no different. After 8-4, now black went a6, and this is normally the move that people make to deal with a5, because if I play a5 now, b5 is a move, and then this a pawn is stranded, and black doesn't have any targets. He hasn't given any targets for white. But the one thing about a6 is that now the pawn on a6 can be a touch vulnerable, because if the rook moves from a8, the bishop's kind of tied to that pawn. So it is a little bit double-edged, but almost everyone plays a6. If I recall, the computer sometimes actually just ignores a6 and allows a5 and just says, you know what, I can play around this pawn. But in many respects, I think it's difficult for a human to go for that type of line, because this pawn tension can be quite a bit annoying. For instance, if black plays queen c7 and then a5, note black doesn't really want to take on a5, because after takes, this white queen pops out to a4, and he recovers the pawn and then has one nice long pawn chain, whereas black would then have 2 pawn islands after having this isolated one on a5. So that pawn tension is kind of annoying, and then the fact that white can kind of open up the queen side whenever he wants and give the a-file to the rook kind of just discourages black from, keeping the status quo. So a6 is natural. And after a6, I went bishop g3. Bishop g3 sometimes isn't necessarily necessary, but the point is that in some lines I'm just prophylactically moving the bishop away from the e5 thrust, because I don't want my bishop to be hit with tempo on f4. So now if he plays e5, I feel much more secure that it's on g3 already. Black now went rook c8. This is an option for the rook. Typically, there are 2 ways that the black rook can develop. One is rook c8, as is played here. Another way is actually rook a7, strangely enough. And the point is here that the queen winds up darting to a8 to influence the e4 square. And there are games that have happened like rook a7, queen b3, queen a8, with black has good control over e4, sort of stopping that thrust in the meantime. And it also gives this rook the opportunity to go to c8 like that. And so even though this rook on a7 looks extremely awkward, there's someday black might, rev up for b5, and then the rook can be bearing down on the a-file. Sometimes also rook b8 is played, and then bishop c6 and b5 like that. So there is a method to the madness with rook a7. It's also something that happens sometimes in Catalans, where rook a7 and queen a8 is a maneuver, but very, very unusual, very, very unorthodox. Instead, rook c8, and now I went rook e1, getting my rook here, also preparing in some lines to entertain e4. The point is I clear this f1 square for my bishop to potentially dart back, and then I can support e4 with my rook and my knight. Now black actually did something quite unusual. In these structures, it's usually a game of cat and mouse because of this pawn tension. Neither side really wants to take. So white doesn't want to play e takes d4 because he loses coverage in the center, and then after b takes c5 or knight takes c5, it's black's quite active. But on the flip side, black isn't so keen to play c takes d4 because after that capture and then e takes, this rook influences pressure on the e7 pawn, and white has a kind of a freer game. So neither side really wants to resolve the tension, and the question is kind of to play around that tension. The flip side is that, both of these bishops, and the dark square bishops here, are kind of blocked out by the respective opponent's pawn chains. And so I'm kind of reluctant to push at one of my pawns because then it opens the bishop on this diagonal. And conversely, black is a little bit reluctant to play e5 or d5 because then my bishop has a diagonal to work with. So it's this kind of tug of war to kind of restrict each other's bishops and keep pawn tension. So the question is how to play around this. And one idea was that rook a7, queen a8 stuff. But another idea is actually to do this in another way. And this hadn't really been played before as far as my database when I checked it. It was very unusual, but Dmitrij had a specific idea in mind connected with rook c7. And his idea, as you'll see, is that after rook c7, I went I went queen b3, getting my queen eyeing this b6 square, maybe restraining the b5 break. And after queen b3, black went queen a8, and this was kind of his concept, was that the rook on c7 is much better placed than it typically is on a7 in that rook lift maneuver, and maybe he can get some play down the c file in some circumstances if he takes. That was my guess. But the point is that he basically went for rook c7, queen a8 instead of rook a7, queen a8. So what's the difference? Well, I think if you take the rook on c7, maybe in some circumstances it actually can be vulnerable to my bishop. So I was not particularly impressed with the square there. But then maybe in other lines he'd be entertaining c4 as an option, trying to shut down the c file. So that was something that I thought about. One flaw I thought with it, in addition to maybe being in the line of my bishop, is that now it seemed kind of unrealistic that he'd ever get in b5 because my rook on a1 is actually hitting the queen. Whereas if this rook was on a7, you could see that b5 would be a little bit more realistic because the rook and queen would be doubled there. So I don't know. I was not so sure what to make of this idea, but it was an interesting decision and novel. So I had to kind of just figure it out. I went bishop f1 now, just kind of sticking with my traditional maneuvers. Now e4 becomes more and more of a possibility. And black went rook fc8. Rook fc8 was interesting because now c4 I thought could be an option in certain positions. But I also was a little bit skeptical of the maneuver because it kind of softened up the f7 pawn a little bit. So I had two thoughts here. I knew that e4 was kind of under control by black's pieces for now. So my candidate moves, or two of my main candidate moves, were playing c4 or knight g5. Typically, c4 is extremely unusual in these structures because you play c4 and then you open this diagonal for the bishop because I don't have a compact chain anymore. But I did think there was some possibility of going c4 and then playing d5 to block out the bishop on b7 and then kind of almost get like a good Benoni structure where I go d5 and e4 and it's kind of ugly for him to play e6 because the d6 pawn is hanging. So I thought this was an attractive option, but I wasn't so sure that after c4 black could play knight e4 hitting my bishop and my knight, and that after a trade on e4, bishop takes e4, this diagonal would be a bit of a problem for me. Now, it turns out I can play knight d2 here, targeting this bishop on e4, and that after c takes d4 and e takes d4, bishop b7 back, it would appear that white's position is actually quite decent, even though this pawn is hanging, because the e7 pawn is loose. And so after rook takes e7, bishop takes d4, and queen a3, the engine actually wants to give white, quite a significant advantage. But yeah, I wasn't totally sure of these lines, and I hadn't worked out all the details that the computer did here. So I was like, I don't know if I want to play with c4 like that. So instead, I opted for my other candidate move, which was knight g5. And my concept here was just to challenge this f7 pawn and force black to make a decision. Black could consider going rook f8 back, but I thought tactically that could be a little bit dangerous. For example, now that the knight is on g5, I'm supporting this e4 thrust, and I thought there were some lines where I could now go e4, because if black goes h6, I thought that knight takes f7 might be a possibility. Point being that after rook takes f7 and e5, it appears that I'm attacking stuff and will have a fork in which I recover my piece. Even if the bishop tries to interpose here after bishop d5, now I have c4 and I'm raining down on this bishop. So I thought that I would have quite a bit of play here after knight g5 and rook f8 and e4, and I thought, well, that would actually be kind of nice. And then if I wasn't down for the tactics, I thought at the very least I can go knight gf3 back and ask black, well, are you comfortable with a draw or not, you know? So just kind of asking black some important questions and having some threats of my own. I thought I had some initiative here and options, which is great. So instead, after knight g5, Dmitrij thought for quite some time and then actually wound up playing c4. And c4 is very, very double-edged because now that this tension on the d4 pawn is gone because he's pushed the c pawn, now after e4, the diagonal isn't such a big deal because, well, my c3 and d4 pawns are still intact. So already after c4, I thought, okay, I can go queen c2, and I thought now I'm actually threatening e4, and he doesn't get the same pressure on the diagonal that he would get in other lines. Additionally, I thought the c4 pawn would be a bit of a liability because now these rooks are kind of tied to defense of this pawn as long as he can't play b5 because of this a file opening up, and he can't go d5 because my bishop is on this line. So I actually thought that c4 could be a bit more of a weakness than a strength, and then the interim I would get my own play going. After queen c2, black went for h6, kicking my knight away. This is reasonable because I was, it was supporting this e4 thrust. And after knight gf3, black moved to stop e4 the only way he can by playing knight e4, putting a piece there. And this is quite typical in London system structures that you put the knight on e4, you stop it for the time being, and you trade a few pairs of minor pieces to alleviate the space disadvantage you might have in the center. Typically, exchanging minor pieces is a good idea. But in this case, again, now that the pawn is on c4, black does not have the same pressure on my center. So I went knight takes e4, and after bishop takes e4, I went queen d1, protecting this knight on f3, and I thought, I'm still threatening e4 because now that the bishop is on this square, I was thinking I can go knight d2, attacking that bishop, and then just push e4, and I thought it was difficult to stop. And so again, I thought I was in pretty good shape here. Now, black could try to stop e4 by going for a move like bishop d5, and then I would go knight d2, and then he could play knight f6 and temporarily stop it. But I can, again, either play queen c2, trying to play for e4 like this, or I can even go for f3. And you can see that e4 ultimately is not going to be stopped. It's just going to be slowed down a little bit. And I thought once I have this nice central duo, white should be a little bit better. The best way to deal with this knight d2 and f5 threat would actually have been to play f5, believe it or not. And the point is to just clamp down on the light square as best you can. And now if I go knight d2 and bishop d5, you could see as additional fuel for the fire here, and then can go knight f6 next. And e4 is not as easy to get off. And this was actually a really reasonable way to play, and I would have had to, figure out a new way to either force through e4 or get counterplay elsewhere. Instead, though, my opponent made the very radical decision to change the nature of the structure and play the move bishop takes f3. This move is very, very double-edged because you are doubling my pawns, but you're giving up the bishop pair to do so. And as we know, the bishop pair is a long-term asset. So the first question I had to, think about here was, how do I take on f3? Do I want to take with the queen or do I want to take with the pawn? Why don't you pause the video and think about it for a minute or two, and then I'll tell you what the solution is. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to weigh the pros and cons of each. I think that in both positions, white would be a little bit better, but I thought taking with the G pawn was actually more effective than the queen, because now that I'm going to have double pawns, I am going to have, in theory, a structural deficit. And I thought that by, keeping the queens on the board, I would actually be able to play with a little bit more dynamics. Whereas if the queens came off the board with an exchange like this, well, I still have the 2 bishops, but his king is definitely not going to be attacked. And he can kind of play it in a more positional nature. So typically when you have dynamics on the board, you definitely want to keep the queens on the board. And so that was kind of my general idea. So I played g takes f3 fairly quickly, thinking that it was important to keep the queens on. The other thing is I thought the queen on a8 was a little bit misplaced and could actually be a target for a bishop potentially coming to g2. So I thought, you know what, this is actually probably, a sensible thing to do. Now, after g takes f3, black went for e5, and this was actually extremely radical. I think his idea was that, in many respects, was to try to close the position. Because, if I try to, well, let's just say I go d5. Well, now the position is closed, and it's going to be difficult to make use of my bishop pair. And same thing is that if I'm insisting on playing e4, now my dark squares are a little bit sensitive, and it's again going to be very difficult for my bishops to really get any activity behind this effective wall of pawns he has. And so he could kind of blockade effectively here, or at least try to. So my question here was, after e5, how do I kind of open up the position effectively and get counterplay? I thought for a while, and then I landed on a solution I liked, and the move was f4. The reason I thought f4 is so strong is that I'm putting pressure on this pawn chain right here, and I thought these pawns are a little bit sensitive, not to mention the fact that the rook on c7 behind it could be vulnerable to my bishop. And the general point was that after e takes d4 and e takes d4, it would appear I have these ugly double pawns, but I'm actually threatening f5 in many lines to open up my bishop and actually just gambit a pawn, potentially open the g file, and so on. So, for instance, let's say black tries to defend d6 in some way. Let's say bishop f8. It's not a good move. Now I have f5 anyway, and this pawn sacrifice is actually really strong because after g takes f5, the queen can start to roam. I can go to h5. I could start with bishop g2, actually kicking the queen off this diagonal. Note that d5 isn't possible because the c7 rook is hanging. And all of a sudden, white is extremely active. So not very desirable for black. The other thing is, if black tries to shut down this f5 thrust by playing f5 himself, now he's weakened the e6 square. And I thought this was something I might be able to take advantage of right away with rook e6. And you can see d6 and g6 are both hanging. And this bishop might pop out to h4 one day and, get a diagonal to work with. So I thought that white would be better even here. So anyways, after f4, black tried to keep the position closed with e4. But if you saw what I was talking about before about the bishop on the diagonal needing life, well, then you'll understand my next move, f5, because now it's not even actually a pawn sacrifice because d6 is just hanging, and just opening up these positions for the bishops really helped me out. Because again, if I didn't go for f5 here, and let's say I went passive with bishop g2, now black can go f5 and just get a nice bind with his pawns that make it difficult for my bishops to activate. So anyways, after e4 and f5, black has a decision to make, defend d6 or take on f5. Black actually, I think, made the wrong decision and played queen d5 and allowed me to undouble my pawns and get everything I wanted. A better move would have been g takes f5. It's still not a good position for black, but at least in this variation, some of his pieces get more active. So I would take on d6 to recover my pawn, but now after rook c6, this rook can swing over to the king side quickly and get some counterplay. I would go bishop g3 back. Now rook g6 swings it over. And now bishop e2, I would play to threaten bishop h5, challenging that rook. And knight f6 stops that threat. And then I'd go king h2, just getting out of the way of the pin. And white is definitely for choice here because I have rook g1. I'm going to play on the g file. I do have the 2 bishops. And, white definitely has a better pawn structure as well with this really nice pawn chain, whereas black's is a little bit suspect. You can see all these kind of loose pawns everywhere, which are kind of targets for later. So white would be better, but this was definitely a better attempt. Instead, after f5 and queen d5, it's kind of amazing, but black's position kind of collapses like a deck of cards. First, I go f takes g6 to just trade that pawn. And after f takes g6, I have a really remarkable move here that just breaks the game open. Why don't you pause the video and try to figure it out? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out the move that was played here. I was kind of noticing that this diagonal after f takes g6, note capturing away from the center, made this king a little bit vulnerable. And after I saw that and I realized, this bishop now has life because of this f4, f5 thrust, I'd love for this bishop to have life. And then I found the move b3. And b3 is a truly remarkable move because it just pries open the diagonal for my bishop and he can't do much about it. Now, the point is that after c takes b3, it looks like I'm just giving up a pawn, but the point is now I have this move c4. And the point is now I just recover the pawn on b3 if the queen moves, and you can imagine now I have a wonderful pawn chain and both my bishops would be playing. So let's say the queen moves back to f7. After queen takes b3, white is just dominating all over the board. And you can see now black's pawn structure is just dreadful. They're pretty much 4 islands here, right? There's this pair, there's this one, and then there's this pair. And you can see that these pawns just aren't connected, and they could just be easily picked off. And, all of black's pieces are kind of terrible. Now, the other line that you have to consider after c4 is the exchange sacrifice rook takes c4. That's the line I was really considering because it's really the only way to try to play this position. But the point is that I can just take the exchange now after bishop takes c4. And after queen takes c4 is really the only move to try to preserve the b pawn. Otherwise, after rook takes c4, I play queen takes b3, and this is a very, very easy conversion, honestly. He could get one pawn back with rook takes d4, but a position like this is a fairly easy conversion because, after these pieces come off, my rook is going to just rake and, take the pawns, and all these pawns are just so weak in black's camp. So, yeah, that pretty much is what happened. So, or what could happen. So instead, the point is after rook takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes c4, I have a nice simplifying task here, and the move is rook c1. And the point is you just can't avoid the trade of these heavy pieces because the c8 rook is hanging. And so you have to play queen takes c1. And after these trades, I can just pick up the b pawn with rook b1 next. Now there's one last trick here that black has to be wary of, or white has to be wary of, and it's actually the move b5. And the point here is that if I take this pawn, that would actually be a serious mistake because black now could play a5 and would have very dangerous connected pass pawns. And believe it or not, after bishop takes d6, bishop f8, takes, rook b1, a4, the computer actually evaluates this position as equal. But I would actually reckon, and I would actually say that this position is much easier to play black and is extremely dangerous because now if the knight gets involved in the act, this pawn could potentially queen. So definitely not something you want to allow, and that's why after b5, the key move here would actually be a5. Ensuring that the b pawn is going to be locked down and secured, and there's no way that black's knight or black's bishop can save this b pawn, and it's just a one position. So instead of these lines, which Dmitrij actually saw, he tried to reinforce the pawn with b5. But the issue here is that I have really awesome pawn tensions here, and I can continue to open up the lines for my bishops, and now my rook on the A file. And so I very hastily went A takes B5, and after A takes B5, I was thinking, well, should I take on C4? Should I rush and take? I was like, no, I can actually threaten to take with the move rook A5. And the point is now I'm threatening B takes C4, and he can't even recapture with the B pawn because the queen is hanging. And then with my rook now in the act, very active, it's just very, very difficult for black to cope. So black now played queen C6, getting out of the way of this B takes C4 idea, but not a very fun move to make because now I resolve the tension with B takes C4 and B takes C4, and now my rook is super active, my bishops are great, this pawn is a target, and now it's just a question of getting the rest of my pieces in the game. And I start with the move queen G4, another tempo gainer. It seems like I've gotten like 5 or 6 moves in a row with tempo now attacking something. And this one, it just attacks G6 and threatens queen E6 check, securing the D6 pawn. And it's just quite clear that black can't contain everything. The other problem is that the move you'd love to make with black is D5, which would secure all of the pawns and even protect G6 for the time being. But again, this rook on C7 is vulnerable. And frankly, maybe that's why this whole setup with rook C7 out of the opening didn't make a lot of sense with the bishop on that diagonal. So after queen G4, black went for king H7. It's the only move not to lose a pawn, to try and save your material, because if you go G5, again, I have queen E6 check. But after king H7, I go queen E6 anyway, and the problem still stands that this D5 now, just weakens too much stuff, really. And now after D5, I can't actually take on C7 because my queen is hanging, but I can actually take on D5. And so, yeah, and then, this position, the rook is still attacked. This pawn now in E4 becomes weak. I still have the 2 bishops. This bishop will eventually get C4 or maybe even E4. And this bishop on G7 is totally locked out of the game. It's totally passive. So he doesn't have any targets to get counterplay, which is almost worse than being down a pawn. So after queen E6, black went for knight F6, trying to maybe get this knight to D5 in some lines or support D5. But you can see here that D6 is hanging, and I gladly took that pawn. And you can see now that the D pawn is gone, the rest of his pawns are just like totally weak and collapsing. Black now went queen B7, trying to at least avoid the trade of queens, because now queen trades kind of exacerbate a lot of his problems. But now I went for the move queen B4 and was actually quite insistent on trading queens because, having these weak pawns, I'd be able to collect them a lot easier if the queens were off the board and my bishops could just play on their diagonals. The other thing that's nice about queen D6 is that I'm stopping knight D5. Like his one source of counterplay might have been knight D5. Let's say I go bishop G2, he goes knight D5, and the knight hits C3 and is supported by the queen. The issue in this position, the line I just showed is actually not so good because E4 is hanging, so maybe knight D5 isn't even a legitimate option. But the point is, the thing I liked about my line with queen B4 is now knight D5 is totally impossible because I could just take the queen and then pick off the knight. So not possible. And so after queen B4, I'm kind of forcing off the queens because in addition to threatening the queen trade, the rook on C7 is now hit by my bishop. And so he pretty much is obliged to trade queens. And after queen takes B4, C takes B4, this rook is still hit. Now, it would appear that I've given this C pawn all of a sudden a new lease on life, and it can just kind of waltz to the queening square. But I had a really nice finesse here. And the point is that after this rook moves to B7, which it did, which attacks the B pawn and sometimes entertains pushing the C pawn, I have this very important move, rook C5. And the issue is I stop the C pawn in its tracks, I challenge the rook on C8, And note that he doesn't really want to trade this rook because he just helps my pawn chain. And now I have two connected passed pawns that will come home and a pawn on c4 that will be lost. Note that, like, if c3 is played, I just go rook c1, and there's really no effective way to support the pawn. I mean, knight d5 is extremely temporary because I have bishop c4, and again, this pawn is just not going anywhere, and I can even push c6 if I want. So rook c5 actually spells huge trouble because now he's actually going to lose a second pawn for nothing. And note that he can't even try to get at the b4 pawn because his bishop is just raking on that diagonal. So after rook c5, black went rook a8, and now I just played rook takes c4, and I'm just 2 pawns up. And, you know, there's just nothing going here. I mean, black tried to get active with rook a2, at least maybe trying to get behind this pawn to target it. But I very alertly played rook b1, not allowing any of that. And now he's just not going to be able to attack the b pawn effectively again, because if he goes rook a4, I just shove it with b5. So this position is actually totally resignable, and if I was black, I would have resigned, but I can understand that, you know, the strong GM, you know, hasn't fully come to terms with the fact that he's losing, and he keeps the game going. And also, I did mention, you know, in previous videos that younger players, it seems, tend to throw more moves at you before they resign, and, you know, even if they're GM level, it seems. I mean, this guy is like almost 2,600 FIDE when I played him. Like, I think it's like 2570, 2580, but still deciding to play on. It is what it is. After rook b1, he played knight h5, challenging my bishop on g3. This wouldn't really change the whole story if I give him the bishop pair, but I wouldn't want to allow that counterplay because my e3 pawn would be a little bit weaker and the game would certainly continue. So I definitely did not want to give him the bishop. And so I started with the move rook c7 to try to force the rook off this file. Note that if he takes on g3, I take the rook. And if he trades, my bishop is out of the line of fire of the knight. And I actually can just walk this pawn home because this bishop is supporting the queening square. So black decided to play rook b6 to avoid the trade of rooks. But now with the rook on the 7th and this bishop pinned, I hopped in with bishop e5. And here, finally, my opponent resigned. Point being that this pin is just super deadly. You know, he pretty much has to go king h8 to relieve the pin. And, well, I mean, there's just no hope in this position. I could trade. And if I want a third pawn, I could consider going bishop g2. If I'm satisfied with what I already have, I can go b5 and rook c6 and just slowly shuttle my b pawn up the board. But in any case, the position's completely lost. And no reason to keep playing. So, yeah. With this win, I got to 6.5 out of 9. You know, and a really, really happy about it. I mean, first place wound up getting 7 out of 9. And actually, first place in this event actually got a spot in the Grenke Chess Classic. So I wasn't too far off the winning score, being a half point off the pace. And okay, I played down most of the rounds, but, you know, it was nice to beat a GM in the last round, and just a really good performance in general. I think my performance rating from this tournament was like 2550, and, you know, performance rating for a GM norm is 2600, given you've also played 3 Grandmasters. So I wasn't too far off the GM norm pace after recovering from a first round draw. So really pleased with the effort and the fighting spirit, and it was something to build on. So I was thrilled. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.